Welcome to our program tonight. On behalf of the Ortonville Community Historical Society, I'm Judy Miracle. When I first moved to Ortonville about 40 years ago, there were 3 big dairy farms here in this area. One was very unique in that their cows had to be moved from one side of Oakwood Road to the other side.
You're welcome.
And so there was a sign there that I believe said cow crossing, although some people say it might have said cattle crossing, so we can argue that. But anyways, it was kind of unique for us as we were moving into the rural area. And we also knew about the Tucker family, the family that owned all those cows and owned that property. When I first joined the Ortonville Community Historical Society, I learned of a local man, Thomas Tucker, who fought in the Civil War. Most recently, we chatted with Beverly Williams at her Aunt Ann's funeral and learned that she had become the collector of the stuff, the collector of the Tucker family photos and stories and the artifacts, and that she had helped transcribe Thomas's diary, which he kept during the war years and afterwards. Our past president, Mary Alice Seal Binder, who is always doing great things for us, encouraged Beverly to share these with the community. And so here we are. Also, we have Larry Hathcock, who is a Civil War reenactor. He came in his uniform, and he will have things to show us later that probably Thomas was used and wore and so on. So, Beverly Williams, great-granddaughter of Thomas Tucker, Civil War soldier from Ortonville. Great. You're going to tell me how many greats. I don't know. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Who is this guy, Thomas H. Tucker? What made him so special? We're all gathered here to learn about him and find out a little bit. But he wasn't a president, he wasn't a governor, he wasn't even a politician of any type. And he was born over 170 years ago. A son of a farmer named John and his wife, Elizabeth Jefferson Tucker, of Wedmore, England. His father was a farmer on the banks of a river channel that ran between Wedmore and Cheddar. Thomas was very close to his family. They were all very close. They were a religious family, and they were all known for their musical abilities. They loved to sing. They'd sing in the evenings, they'd sing at church. They'd sing anytime they could. You're going to have to bear with me because I don't have a mouse, so we'll see how this goes. This is John. This is Thomas's father. This is the first Tucker to Ortonville. Cheddar was where Thomas's mother was from, and Wedmore was where his father was from. John raised a small herd of cattle, and he had a small fruit orchard too. And Thomas had 5 siblings: Mary, Anna, John, Robert, and Elizabeth, also known as Libby. This is a little map. And right here is Cheddar, and right here is Wedmore. My Uncle Don did visit Wedmore and Cheddar quite a few years ago, and he said it was kind of a quaint little place. Also, these homes were out of the time that Thomas's family lived in Wedmore. Could have been he lived in something very similar to these. Well, what was so different about Thomas? He was a son, he was a brother, he was a farmer, a soldier, a friend, a husband, an uncle, just like so many others during this period. Personally, I think it was his perseverance, his honesty, his commitment, and his determination, his loyalty, his hard work, and his compassion. And most of all, he left a footprint of his life with others that's lasted for generations. and hopefully it'll last for generations to come. And it was all through his writing. The Tucker family of 8 came to America, precisely Ortonville, Michigan, in 1854. Thomas, he was a mere boy of 9. His sister Mary was about 16, Anna 15, John 14, and Robert 12. His sister Libby was 5. How and why did they pick Ortonville? And how could they afford to leave? They weren't rich. The story goes, and is documented in the Eaton family book, that Thomas's father was digging on his property near the river when he came on a strange find. He continued to dig until he unearthed what turned out to be a chest. When he opened it, it was full of gold doubloons that were probably buried there hundreds of years before by the pirates. Often back then, the pirates would go up these river channels and bury their treasure before going back to sea to capture more treasure or unassuming ships. During the same time that Thomas's father found his treasure, another one was unearthed between the cemetery and the church, and it was full of silver coins. And this find was documented in a little Wedmore history book. During this time, Queen Victoria reigned the region. If anything of this magnitude was found, it had to be turned over to the crown. Well, John notified the crown, and they sent the royal guards to retrieve the treasures from the farmer. And when they came, they gave each family member 6 gold doubloons. Whew, that must have been like winning the lottery now. Now was their opportunity to leave England and to come to the United States, where money, they had heard, actually did grow on trees. But why did they pick Ortonville? Because they already had cousins here. The Levi Walters family lived in Ortonville, and they could stay with them until they got established. Only they didn't know was Levi was dirt poor, and he had a family of 10. But they'd soon find that out when they got here. When they got to Clarkston, by train, they asked directions to Ortonville. Someone misdirected them way out of their way. They ended up going miles out of their way down Baldwin Road. And there were first-hand accounts documenting the first day to Ortonville. Young as Miss Eaton was at school on the corner of Oakwood Road and State Park Road when they stopped by the school to fill their canteens with water. When she returned home that afternoon, her mother also had a story of the Tuckers on their way to their cousin's home. Her mother recalls seeing them, each one of them carrying a knapsack and a canteen. They stopped by a water hole to wash their feet and wash up. Then they put their shoes and socks on. They carefully combed and groomed themselves, and then they continued the journey on their way. When they reached the Walters family, they were quite surprised by the fact that they were very poor. But just like the Tuckers, the Walters family loved their music, and every evening the two families would sit around and sing together. Probably it made their day seem a little bit better. It wasn't long, though, before John bought some land. It was government land. It was so poor that no one had settled on it. Even the forest trees didn't grow well on the land, so he could purchase 68 acres for only a few dollars an acre. The neighbors had a beef for him, and the family had a constructed house made out of logs. Thomas's father took on work at the neighboring farms to help pay for salt pork and flour and any other kind of food his family needed. They managed to get a cow or two. Elizabeth saved enough sour milk for cooking. She mixed it with soda powder for baking powder. For a long time, Elizabeth had a pail that she had to rub the clothes together in to get them clean. Finally, she was able to get a washboard. Oh, what a lifesaver. Mrs. Eaton had given Libby a chicken, and soon she had a small flock. She'd sell her eggs and get more chickens. They exchanged the eggs at the store for calico and sugar and coffee. John and Elizabeth were determined to make it, and they wanted their children educated in a good country school. They wanted them to be able to read, write, and do arithmetic. And in time, the Tucker family became quite prosperous. They planted a few trees and many various types of berry bushes. As time went by, John raised a small herd of cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, and the land today would be part of the Bloomer State Park, number 3, on State Park Road in Ortonville. I believe the house would have been around the site that the old Walter Bendig home stood, for you of them that's been here for a while. In 1989, my husband, cousin John, and Bob from Washington to California, and I walked the property, looking for signs of the orchard. Across from the site of the old Bendig home were the lilac bushes and a big old apple tree. Down in the ravine, we found many different kinds of berry bushes. The Category 5 cyclone of 1896 that came through Ortonville and killed many, along with total destruction to property and trees, had wiped out most of the fruit trees. But it was still exciting to find at least one old tree standing. This is just a picture. This is of the Quicks farm that was on Sands Road, of what that tornado did. It was huge. It just devastated. At the site here, 9 people were killed. And this is a little picture where Thomas's property would have been, and the Eaton property. The Civil War broke out, and John, the eldest, enlisted at Fort Wayne on August 28, 1861. John was in the 5th Michigan Cavalry, Company A. He was well liked, and he seemed to have many friends. He wrote his family and friends, which included numerous young ladies, especially Phoebe Lawrence. John was killed in action on May 5th, 1862, and the Battle of Williamsburg. There were so many killed then, it took a little time for the news to reach John's family. Tom was working in a field and threw down his pitchfork with his friend Charlie Atkins when they decided to enlist to revenge his brother's death. Thomas's parents were devastated. They didn't want him to enlist, but he told them he had made up his mind and he was going. Charlie and Thomas walked all the way to Pontiac. They spent the night and were sworn in on August 14, 1862, into the Michigan 22nd Infantry, Company D. Thomas's mother and father, they were just devastated. They had just received news that their son had been killed, and now the other one enlists. When Thomas got home, his father told him, "I'll go back with you. I can get you out. You're only 17 years old. You're not old enough." But Thomas refused. He said he'd made up his mind and he was going. Other men from the Ortonville that were in the 22nd Michigan Infantry Company D included Charlie Atkins, George Atkins, Thomas Allen, William Howland, Ura Irish, William Maynard, and Daniel Rome. During the course of the war, the weather was so important to him. Quite often it would be the determining factor on how the regiment's health was. It was a difficult 3 years. He marched in knee-deep mud or pouring rain and snow. It was either very hot or very cold. At one point, he fell off a bridge at Lookout Mountain while he was working on it. And that's how he received his pension, was from that fall. In his pension papers, it said he received piles, what we would call hemorrhoids today. That got him a pension of about $10 a month. He was injured several times, but really never talked about it much. During the time, he learned the meaning of true compassion and to love thine enemies. Remember, when he went in, he was going to revenge his brother's death. He was angry. He wanted to kill all the Rebs. I'd like to share just a few things that he did while he was in that war, to show what kind of a person Thomas really was. In June of 1864, There were prisoners in the company. He felt bad for the Rebs because so many of them were just young boys from 14 to 16 years old. There was one in particular that he felt so bad for, a young Reb whose mother was ill, and all he wanted to do was go home. He was in the Georgia 54th Infantry, and they were close to his home. When Thomas took 10 of the prisoners down to the pool of water to wash and bathe, the young Reb said he had a stomach problem, so Thomas told him to step into the bush and take care of it. The boy moaned and groaned a bit, and then there was silence. All the other Rebs began to laugh, and they told Thomas, "That young Reb, he's surely's taken off. He's probably halfway home by now." Thomas made the other Rebs promise not to say anything about the boy, and he bunched them together, and he hurried them back into the stockade so they couldn't be counted. What wasn't in the diary, but was in a letter to home, was he talked to the boy earlier, and he told the boy to step into the bush. "When I turn my back, I want you to skedaddle." He could have got in a lot of trouble for that. On March 28, 1865, that was the date of the bullet hole letter. Thomas, we'll go back to that. Thomas never talked too much about his injuries, but this one he was surely grazed. A letter to his parents had a hole through it, right through it, and there was blood stains around each hole. He had the letter in a pocket to mail when he was shot. It hit the breast of his pocket. It went through a pocket watch, which basically stopped the bullet, but it still went through enough to draw blood. I don't know about you, but if I had a son that was killed in the war, I had another one that was in the war that I was worried to death about, and then I received a letter with a bullet hole through it and his blood on it, I would have been over the top. But maybe in Thomas's mind, he thought, well, they'll know I'm still all right if I mail this. But it was also an important letter. It was a letter addressing his father on who needed the ointment, what to make up for his piles. So he had to mail this letter. And I do have a picture of the letter. It didn't copy very good, but here's the envelope. And this was also used to get his pension. And he had the letter folded, and you can see each hole here. On July 30th, 1864, Thomas was in a berry patch, picking and eating berries with his friend at Peachtree Creek, where he smelled a terrible stench. They started looking around, and pretty soon they found him. It was a dead Reb. He was so young, and he had 2 letters in his hand and a Bible in the other. Thomas read the opened one, and it was from the Reb's girl. Oh, he felt awful bad that this young man was killed and laid there by himself and no one to know. In a letter to home, he talked about the event, but he added that he had mailed the unopened letter because it was addressed to his girl. In December of 1864, Thomas was standing guard over a stockade pit where they were holding Reb prisoners. He noticed a young Reb without a shirt and hat. He hollered down and asked the boy, "Where's your shirt and hat?" And much to his surprise, the boy said he didn't have any. Thomas asked him if he had any money. The boy answered yes. Thomas told him, well, for a shirt and a hat, it'd be about $2. If you've got $2, you go get it and you wrap it up in some paper and see if you can throw it up to me. And if you can, when I get off duty, I'll walk to town. And then I'll bring you a shirt and a hat back. Well, the young boy took off. Pretty soon he came back. And he had $2 wrapped up. He threw it up to Thomas, and Thomas caught it. When Thomas was done with his shift that day, he walked all the way to town. Now you gotta think, he's worked all day, being guard duty, probably back and forth over this pit. Now he walks quite a distance to town. But he walked to town to buy the shirt and the hat. By the time he got back, it was almost dark. But as he crossed the edge of the pit, the young boy saw him, and he hollered, "Did you get it?" Thomas dropped down the package and said yes. You know, I think that was something that Thomas could have really gotten in trouble for, because he was smuggling in things to the Rebs. But now his compassion had taken over, and they weren't anymore his enemies. He felt bad for these young boys, so many of them so young, so many of them with nothing. But then I think about this young Reb. Thomas must have been a trusting person, because he also threw $2 to the enemy, trusting that he was going to go to town and buy that hat and shirt. And he didn't have to do that. On June 26, 1865, Thomas finally received his discharge papers. July 2nd, 1865, Thomas was on his way home. Coming across the hills in the field, he could see his father working in the field. I could just see him running across the field, hollering, "Father, Father, Father!" And I'm sure his father was running at him just as hard as he could. After they had talked for a moment, they went back to the house to see his mother, who I'm sure was quite delighted. Thomas got back into his normal routine of farming. He worked a lot of times at other farms, was paid by money, livestock, maybe some wood. He'd go to town and trade and barter goods. He usually came home with money in his pocket or food or whatever he needed. The family was very religious, went to church every Sunday and Sunday night, and through the week they attended many church events. Many times it took place in someone's home. Thomas met Thurza Markham at church. The Markhams lived out to Bald Eagle Lake, and Thomas had fell in love. He was 25 years old, and Thurza was 16. They were married August 17, 1869, in Pontiac. Thomas's brother Robert had married Flora Gales of Goodrich. Anna had married Lurse Brown. Libby had married Almond Smith. And Mary had married Nelson Eaton. And I'm going to show you some pictures of Thomas's family here. This is Anna. This is one of his older sisters. This is Libby. This is the youngest of the family. I'll just leave that there. Thomas and Thurza lived with Thomas's parents. Since his brothers and sisters were all married now, Thomas worked hard as always and started to purchase a little land. On April 1871, he purchased 2 corner lots in Ortonville on the corner of Schoolhouse and Church Street. The yearly taxes was going to be $4.52 a year. Wow. There were potatoes planted on that property at one time, and then a house was constructed many years later. This property is also one of the lots that my Aunt Helen and Uncle Russ Jenks lived while they were raising their family. I remember once mentioning to my Aunt Helen about our great-grandpa owning it, and she was surprised at that time. On May 19, 1871, Thomas and Thurza had their first child. In Thomas's own words, Thurza was sick, and at 11 o'clock a baby boy was born. And boy, that baby's smart. Thomas continued his hard work in saving and purchasing fruit trees. He also bought more land. He bought 40 acres. And he insisted that deeds be right. He wouldn't purchase anything unless it was. On May of 1862, Thomas became the Sunday school teacher. And since the Tuckers loved to sing, it was no surprise that in 1875, Thomas became the singing teacher, and he had 30 students. This was something he thoroughly enjoyed. On July 2nd, 1872, Thomas purchased his father's 68 acres for $2,000. Thomas began expanding their home. He did all the lathe work and father did the plastering. They needed more room and he was quite skilled with his building techniques. They had a lot of company and they enjoyed visiting others often. They were so social and they enjoyed to help their neighbors. He even would work on the roads when they got bad. January 1st, 1873 was another day of devastation for Thomas. His sister Mary, who had married Nelson Eaton and lived just up the hill on Hornet Road, died. She had 2 small daughters, Anna and Emma. Mary is buried in the Eaton Cemetery on Hornet Road. I found it rather interesting that his sister Anna told him, "Thomas, it'll be all right. It's one less tie on earth, but one more tie in heaven." I felt it showed that their belief, and it seemed to help Thomas. In September of 1873 was a pretty exciting day. He was elected school director for District 4. This was a 3-year term, and he was only 29 years old. People must have respected him to have such a prestigious job, especially in that time. And I also found it interesting that in November of 1873, Thomas went and picked up his father, who was in Holly. He'd come in on the stagecoach from Ypsilanti, where he'd been working for a few months plastering. Thomas's father at the time would have been 67 years old, still working on the farm, and now working outside the home, plastering ceilings. That's a difficult job at any age. I think it showed a testament to him. They always looked so old and weathered, but their work was so hard. Thomas's family always had big gardens with beans and turnips and potatoes, along with their crops of corn and wheat and hay. And we can't forget the fruit trees that were now bearing fruit. And there were many different kinds of berries in the berry patches. Of course, he had his cattle herd with a good size now, with horses and chickens and pigs and sheep. And on November 1875, Thomas served on jury duty in Ortonville. It was the Humsummer and the Black lawsuit. He said they brought a verdict against Mr. Black. I was really unaware that there was any kind of court ever in Ortonville, but probably back then they kept things to the villages themselves. November of 1875 added new duties to him. He became the young people's Bible class teacher, a job he enjoyed so much. With his religious background and his love for children, it was a perfect fit for him. On May of 1879, his second son was born, Archibald, who went by the name of Archie. I'm sure one of the most difficult times in Thomas's life was when his father passed away. He died June 18, 1882, at the age of 76 years old. His mother died on September 3rd, 1885, and she was 79 years old. On December 12th, 1886, Thomas and Thurza had a third son. John was born. This is a picture of Will and Archie and John when they were older, of course. Thomas and Thurza's eldest son, William, which was my great-grandfather, married Cynthia Yetter in 1891. William was 19, soon to be 20, and Cynthia was 19 herself. They bought land on the corner of Oakwood Road and Hadley Road, which they called the Walnut Hurst Farm. And this is a picture of the farm. This is a side view. And this is Will and Cynthia. The last I knew, the home has been occupied for many years by the Rathburgs. On May 2nd, 1892, Will and Cynthia had a son. Carl William Tucker was born. Carl was my grandfather, and I have so many memories of him. My cousin Tim and I would go to the Hadley Granary with him to get the corn ground, and while he'd be in there, he'd say, well, let's go over to the general store. What you need to know about my grandpa is he had sugar, and you have to stay away from sweets. But as long as we promised not to tell Grandma, we made out pretty good. We'd each get a single dip cone while he got a triple dipper. Then we'd go pick it up and we'd go on home. Somewhere along the road, he'd probably slam on the brakes on that old green Ford truck and say, did you see that fly in the road? I never saw it, but he would do it, and then he'd chuckle, and away we went. This is a picture of Thomas on the far side, Will on this side, who is his son, my Grandpa Carl in the middle, and that's Grandpa Carl's firstborn, Blanche, on his lap. Thomas and Thurza retraced their footsteps back to Chattanooga and Lookout Mountain. I've often thought that must have really stirred up some bad memories, but maybe some good ones too. Here's a picture of him hanging out, literally. He got more guts than I would have had. Thomas belonged to the John Tucker Post, 197. The post was named after his brother John that was killed during the war. There's also in the little display box over here, it'll show, and it said Ortonville. But here is a picture of the medal, and you can see Ortonville. Whoops, now I gotta get creative. Let's see.
We could all just turn around.
Right, oh, there I go. Okay. Put that. This is a cool picture, so I need to get it to flip. Picture of the GAR. And then Thomas is right in the front, up at the top. Get ready, because there's two more sideways too. On May 25th, 1896, devastation hit Ortonville. But Oakwood and Thomas suffered so tragically too. It was the Category 5 cyclone. Thomas's big home was leveled, but no one was hurt. He also lost his 2,115 fruit trees, 12 acres of timber, and 108 acres of real estate were damaged and recorded in the Northeast Oakland Historical Society book entitled The Michigan Cyclones of 1896. Thomas's son, William, also lost 15 stock, 100 fruit trees, and 3 acres of timber. It must have been about then when Thomas moved to town, as it shows Thomas residing there on a map later in the year of 1896. He used to live in the second house up the hill from the old mill on the left side of the road. I always called it the Vanderwerk house when I was a kid. It had a grand parlor and could hold many people for gatherings. This is where they lived until his death on November 20th, 1916. Whoops. Well, here's a picture before I get there. I believe it would be maybe at the old stables or at the old blacksmith shop in Ortonville. And Thomas is the second guy in. We have other people in it. Alex Jones and Alex Giles were also in the picture. This is a picture in the parlor, and I believe this is probably one of his young people's Bible study groups, because most of them are fairly young. Thomas's two sons, Archie and John, were rather adventurous, and they had moved to go out west. They picked up and moved to Washington. The boys started a very lucrative orchard, and when the automobile was introduced, John started a garage in Govan, Washington. The two boys were married there and raised their families, and they visited here a few times, and also Thurza and Thomas went to visit them. Love them outfits there. Archie's the one way over, and John is sitting down, and of course Thomas is standing. When Thomas passed away, he passed away at home from bronchial pneumonia on November 20th, 1916. The one thing I should say is when Thomas was in the Civil War, they didn't go to the doctors. And if he did, and they gave him medicine, he took it out back of the tent and threw it away. He saw the reaction of this medicine on others. He would send a letter to Father and tell him what was wrong and have Father tell him what to make him feel better. He didn't like hospitals either, because every soldier that went in the hospital, most of them didn't come out. So imagine when he got his cold, he tried to take care of it himself. The obituary said that Thomas was 13 years old when he was converted at a revival at the old Red Schoolhouse, and soon afterwards he was reunited with the Baptist Church in Ortonville. He was a faithful member and the chorister for over 50 years. It also talked about his enlistment and stated that he served his country fearlessly without thought of reward or advancement. Thomas was only 72 years old at the time of his death. His sons Archie and John came home from Washington for the funeral. William, of course, had stayed in Ortonville. When Archie and John went home, they took with them many of the family heirlooms. A few of these things were like his rifle, his saber, his belt, and some of the old diaries, and a gold doubloon that Thomas had kept all those years. I'm sure there had been many times when Thomas could have used that doubloon, but he didn't. He kept it. And his son Archie kept it. It was in his possession until November of 1954 when he passed away. He had become very ill, and they had to hire a nurse to stay and be his caretaker. After his death, the nurse was gone, and so was the doubloon. William did keep his Civil War diary, which he carried with him in the Civil War, some compasses, some pictures, some deeds, and many shares in different gold mines. And in this little box over here, this is some of the things that were in there. William and Cynthia's son Carl had married Leora Ruth Smith, and Leora was 22 years old, and Carl was 20. She was known mostly to all her friends by Ruth. And see here if I can get this to go. This is my grandpa and grandma Tucker. They started a farm on Hadley Road, just down the road from Carl's father, but on the opposite side. It had been a little past the Van Tine house, farm. And they lived there for 5 years, at which time they had a daughter, Blanche, born in 1914, a daughter, Ina, born in 1960, and Ina would have been my mom. In about 1917, they moved to the farm at 1960 Oakwood Road that they called the Basswood Grove Farm. It's commonly called the Tucker Farm. They spent the rest of their lives on that farm. They had 4 more children. Helen, born in 1918, Edith, born in 1921, Nelson, who went by Bill, in 1926, and Donald, born in 1929. There's a picture of the farm. Blanche married Lyman Krug and had 2 children, Randall and James. Ina married Milton Diener and had 2 children, Sharon and Beverly. Helen married Russell Jenks, had 2 children, Linda and Nancy. Edith married Orville Pagel and had 1 son, Lee. Nelson married Anna Zander and had 2 children, Thomas and Timothy. And Donald married Lucille O'Mara and he had 2 children, Barry and Sandra. This is a picture of my grandpa and grandma and their kids. And just so you know, that this Tucker family was very musical too, because I have a picture. In later years, when Bill and Don were grown, Carl sold the farm to his sons on March 1st, 1958. He still helped work the farm and remained in the house. Bill and Don farmed the land in early 1960s when Don decided that he might want to take a new adventure, that maybe farming wasn't for him, and he moved to California. There had been an apartment put in the upstairs of the old farmhouse, and in 1956, my parents, my sister, and I moved upstairs. My grandma Ruth passed away in 1959, and my grandpa passed away in 1967. At that time, my parents and I moved downstairs. My sister had moved to California and had been married, and it was downstairs and in the old hidden stairway that used to lead to the upstairs that I made my discovery that changed everything about me and how I felt about family treasures. It was a snowy night. I remember I was about 16, and I was a little bored. My mom had mentioned cleaning out that old stairway, but it was a lot of work. But that night seemed a good time to do it. When you opened the door, it was a coat closet, basically, with your boots and your shoes that sat on the steps. So you moved the cloaks back, and you could go up the old stairway. I'm looking on some shelves that had been built over the stairs, and I found an old shoebox. It was pretty ratty. I opened the box, and I thought, my, there's a lot in here. So I took that box, and I sat on my bed, and I remember going through it. There were Thomas Tucker's old deeds to all different properties. There were many, many shares and stocks for different gold mines all over. There were compasses and this little black book. That little black book turned out to be my great-great-grandpa Thomas H. Tucker's Civil War diary that he carried in his pocket. And it was there that my adventure and my need to know more about the Tuckers and the family took flight. And even though the diary is very brittle, this is how it started out. It's pretty legible. You can kind of read it. By the time it gets to the end, on that side you can see, and you have to remember, he used the old ink pens that you had to put in ink. How he did it, I don't know. He had to have been disciplined. There wasn't a day he missed during the whole time. It's been quite an adventure. I found family and descendants of Archie and John in Washington and California. And in May, of 1989, the son of Archie, Robert, and his wife Nancy, along with John, son John, and his wife Mildred, visited for 5 days while we lived on the farm yet. They were able to meet many of my relatives and see the places in the community that Thomas had left his mark. And I had the pleasure of meeting their family in 1999 at a Tuckeroo reunion that was held in Eureka, California. I also found a family member in Wedmore, England in 1969. He sent me so much information on Wedmore and the dates of interest for my family, but passed away shortly afterwards. In 1993, the old brick house that Carl had lived in and started his family caught on fire. And then again, within a few days, another fire. And it destroyed the inside of the house. It had to be torn down. And on December 1st of 1993, Bill passed away. The following year, 1994, brought the biggest changes to the legacy of the Tucker farm. Tom and Tim had decided to stop farming. Their children had all ventured in different directions, and it was time. The cattle were sold, the buildings torn down, the land subdivided, and it's now the Tucker Estates. Today, the only living family member of Carl and Ruth Tucker is Donald, who's 88 years old. Don and his second wife, Barb, now still reside in Escondido, California. Thomas H. Tucker, he left a footprint in my heart after reading his writings and tracing his roots, and I know I'm a better person for that. Just with Thomas's life of loyalty, his devotion to God, his family values, and his willingness to help others. How could you not should be changed? And if you don't mind, I would like just to take a moment before I conclude to introduce some of Thomas's other relatives that are here today. And if you would, when I call your names, would just stand up until everybody stood. Jim Krug is the great-great-grandson of Thomas. Hang on until we get them all. You got to stay standing. They don't want to stand by themselves. Just Tim Tucker, the great-great-grandson. Tom Tucker, the great-great-grandson. Nancy Bartle, the great-great-granddaughter. Is Lee, did I see Lee?
He's in the hallway.
He's in the hallway. Tell him to come in.
Nowhere to be seen.
No. Lee Pagel is here also, who was the great-great-grandson. We have Thomas's great-great-great-grandson, Timmy Tucker. We have Thomas's great-great-great-granddaughter, Carrie Tucker. We have Thomas's great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth Dunn. And I'm looking to see who else I got here. We have the cameraman over here, Thomas's great-great-great-grandson, Mike Bartle. We have Thomas's great-great-great-great-grandson, Brandon Cornell. And did I get everybody? This is some of Thomas's family. And I think I forgot. Now I I'd just like to conclude, or before I conclude, I'd like to add a little bit about growing up on the farm and living there literally half my life. I have so many unforgettable memories. I loved to help my grandma when she gathered eggs from the chicken coop and when she made her incredible molasses cookies. I got to take that little pot out to the barn to scoop back the flies to dig in the molasses. And were the best cookies you ever ate. I'm not sure why, but And I loved helping in the hay or riding on top of a wagon stacked high. And who could forget picking up rocks in the field on that with the tractor and the stone bolt sled. The dirt and dust would be flying, and by the time you were done, you looked like you'd have been in the Dust Bowl era. It was bad, but it was kind of fun. And then there was the sliding through the barnyard in your bare feet after the rain. Who could have done that in the city? Living on the farm enabled me to raise and take care of many different kinds of animals that I would have never had the opportunity to. And I love animals. I had raccoons and pheasants and ducks and turkeys and even a woodchuck that had been wounded by a car. I let them all go in the spring when they'd heal. But some of them were a little more dangerous. I used to have to wear welding gloves to feed the woodchuck. Oh yes, I had the normal animals. I had cats and a pony and the chickens and rabbits and lots more rabbits and lots more rabbits. They do multiply. Our play might be building a tree fort in the old apple tree down the lane behind Uncle Bill's. Or maybe it was building a raft to use on a pond only to have it sink. In the fall, we'd rake the leaves and make rooms and pretend they were our homes. And the basswood trees, they also provided us with a pea-like fruit that was great to launch at each other in our games of war. And the old tree swing that hung from the basswood tree by the porch spent many hours of enjoyment for all of us. Or perhaps it was playing baseball with my cousins in the field or the yard. By the way, I could throw a ball just as hard and just as far as any of those guys. Maybe we'd spend the afternoon playing in the driveway or the dirt with our toy cars. Or maybe we'd lie on our backs and make pictures out of the clouds. At night, well, there could be flashlight tag, or we could try and find some lightning bugs to catch. We never locked our doors. And in the steamy, hot summer nights, there was no air conditioning, just fans. So all the windows were left open. And in fact, the keys were probably in the car that's parked in the driveway. Parents didn't worry about their kids. If you went out to play in the morning and didn't come back till dinner, they knew you were safe. My cousins were more like my brothers and sisters than my cousins. They were my friends, my protectors. And growing up in Ortonville when I was a kid, you had a sense of pride. It didn't matter if you were 2 or 102. Everyone knew everyone. When someone in the community would pass away, everyone was quick to make a dish to take to the family of some type of food. And there would be someone in the neighborhood going door to door to collect for flowers. And in the farm areas, there were long distances between some of the houses, but it didn't matter. If someone was down on their luck or sick, the Stars, the Mason, the churches, they'd put on dinners of all sorts to raise money, sometimes just to donate food to help whoever it was through their hard luck. My Uncle Lighting was the one and only mail carrier. And when my cousin Randy was in service overseas, he'd write my mom, Aunt Ina, Ortonville, Michigan. She always got that letter. Try that today. My Aunt Helen worked at the Genesee Bank, which is where the MSU Credit Union is located. And my mom, Ina, she was a cashier in Modern Food, which was a local grocery store in town, right next to Featherston's Hardware. The school, it housed K through 12. My class was the last one to graduate from that school. And if you rode the bus, you could sit right under there with the bus driver and operate the door when someone got on and off the bus. And there was just enough girls interested in softball to have one team. We were all good players, and Wilma Reed, if any of you remember, and her husband was our coach. When we had a home game, that was perfect. But when we had an away game, we had no way to go. They had this big old station wagon, and they'd pile us all in there and haul us wherever we needed to go. And I bet most of you may not know or have forgotten that there were 4 acres behind the old farmhouse at 1960 Oakwood Road that were apple and pear orchards. My grandpa would sell the apples and pears and give the money to my grandma for her church tithes. In 1958-59, I can remember my grandpa and my uncles clearing the orchard to make more room for their crops and for the cattle to graze. When we were older, there was still an old apple tree and an old pear tree across the road. That was still a Tucker thing, the orchards. They started in Wedmore and they came to even 1960 Oakwood Road. My husband and I went by the old farm a few months ago, and I told my husband, I remember all the hard work they did to clear out the trees. And now it's all full of houses. And look, everyone's planted some kinds of trees. They're all bad. But there's still an old basswood tree on the northwest side of where the house would have been to Market's Place. I'd like to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share Thomas Tucker and the Tucker Farm legacy with you. There's a shadow box over here. Please take a moment and look at it. It's some of the things that I found in that old shoebox. The diary was way too fragile, but it is in there for you to see what it was like. And I've enjoyed this time with you, and I just would like to say, Lee Pagel, now you have to stand up by yourself. That's Thomas Tucker's other great-great-grandson.
I can't believe this. I was totally enthralled with your whole thing. You are a great storyteller. Thank you. Here you go. Thank you very much.
I also want to say that in the very near future, the little diary I am going to be donating to the old mill. I want to be sure that nothing happens to it again, because many of the things out west, after the older people died, it's scattered all over. My volumes that I put together, and I say volumes, of all my family history, once I get everything exactly where I want it, I'm going to donate them to the library, so that any given time, somebody can find what they need, including our family. But everybody will know where it is. So, but thank you again.
I'd like to give you a little bit of an idea of what some of the things that Thomas Tucker carried with his equipment. I can't know for sure exactly, but I do know from his diary he carried an Enfield Rifle, appropriately made in England, and the 22nd was equipped with that. They got these before they left Pontiac. They trained at the old fairgrounds in Pontiac, which is between Saginaw and currently Perry Street, and they learned how to march, take care of their equipment before they went off to war. They first went to Cincinnati and helped kind of repel the Rebs from taking Cincinnati. Eventually ended up in Nashville, then down to the Chattanooga area, and he participated in the second day of the Battle of Chickamauga. It's amazing he survived that. About 4.5 hours of combat, a couple of bayonet charges, and he helped a friend of his from Ortonville back to the surgeons. He'd been wounded, and the time he started to go back to his regiment, he found out that they had been captured. A third of the regiment was lost in that battle. And after that, they mainly were doing provost marshal duties like policemen, and also engineering. Did a lot of work, which the Army is good for, turning into a worker. But this will give you an idea of some of the equipment that he carried. He mentioned in his diary that they had a knapsack, so he probably carried a knapsack. But a lot of soldiers, they found the knapsack cut into their shoulders, and they would wrap up their blanket, their shelter half, into this rubberized poncho, which would keep everything dry. These ponchos, was canvas that was covered with rubber. You might have heard of the guy who invented this. His name was Goodyear. He got tired of making these. No, that's a joke. Somebody tired of them. Anyway, so he started making, as automobiles came along, they used the rubber to make tires. Some men found that this was more comfortable. Also, if they went into battle and carried this, it gave them a little bit of protection. Not much, but a little bit. Also, if you're marching, you know, you put this 9.5 pounds of gun on your shoulder, you feel a little bit more comfortable as you march along. The men, their main job as any soldier is to fire their rifle and defeat the enemy. And a well-trained soldier could fire about 3 shots a minute out of this gun if they were well-trained. This is a very modern rifle. It's very accurate at long range, and this is why the Civil War was so deadly. The soldiers would be given 40 rounds before a battle. These would be made up by women and young girls in factories. There's a Manet bullet up here at the top. The powder is down here. They put this in their mouth. They have to tear it loose. And once that's done, they keep the bullet in their mouth. They pour the powder down the barrel, then place the bullet, which is smaller than the barrel, and it'll go down in there. They push it down with their thumb, and then to get it all the way in, they have to take out this ramrod. You can imagine doing this in battle. Push this all the way down, seat it, bring it back all the way up. You don't put it back in the rifle, you throw it in the ground because you're going to need it. Then, to fire it, you got to pull this back. You reach into this cap box. If some of you as kids had cap guns, you know if you hit that little bead, it explodes. That's called fulminate of mercury. That is inside this little cap. Cap guns derive their name from the fact that Civil War guns were fired with this cap. You put this on here, pull it all the way back, and when you fire it, a small spark goes from this down this tube into the firing chamber and shoots the weapon. Now you keep doing that, hopefully, without making a mistake, that routine, and a person in combat, well-trained, could get off probably about 3 shots a minute. Sometimes men would get in a hurry, they'd shoot the ramrod. Sometimes they couldn't tell that the gun had gone off. And there have been cases where they found guns on battlefields that had 4 or 5 charges already in the barrel. It's probably a good thing the gun didn't go off because it would have been goners. But this is mainly their job, was to go into combat and fire this weapon. When they ran out of ammunition, as the 22nd did at Chickamauga, they then revert, they ask, what do? We have no ammunition. Use cold steel. That means this. They pick out this bayonet, take this very modern rifle, and turn it into a very old weapon called a spear. You now have a spear. Now this here is a psychological weapon. Did you feel a little nervous when I swung this thing around? You should, because that's the reaction people had. There's reports that very few reports of injuries from bayonets were recorded in the Civil War. People say, you know what, those bayonets, all that stuff you read about bayonet charges, that never happened. Yes, it did. We know it did. But how come people weren't wounded? Let me ask you a question. If you saw 100 or 1,000 men coming at you with this weapon like this, what would you do? Well, of course, you're going to stand there where you're get off 3 shots a minute, right? There's 1,000 guys coming. Well, maybe I'll get 1 of them, 2 of them. They keep coming. They don't have to reload this. And so in many cases, the enemy would turn and run because of this weapon, which is a pretty nasty weapon. I wouldn't want to be stabbed with it. And it's intentionally triangle shaped. That wasn't not by accident. A punctured wound in your body that has like a triangle takes the longest to heal. They didn't know about germs, but they knew that men who were wounded like this would eventually die because of the infection. So this is their main equipment for fighting with. As they're on marches, they could throw away a lot of things. They could throw this away if it was heavy. And sometimes Thomas would march 17 miles in a day. dusty roads or muddy roads or whatever. And that gets heavier and heavier. This gun goes from 9 pounds to probably 20 pounds by the time you are marching at the end of the day. They could not throw away the military equipment. They couldn't throw away their ammunition. They couldn't throw away the bayonet. They could throw away anything else, personal belongings, and also their rations and other items in this bag, which is called a haversack. And this is what they would carry their rations in out on the march. A soldier on the march would get 3 days rations. Basically, they would get some coffee. They would get some hardtack. Get some of that out. Show you the hardtack. And of course, their most important item, their coffee cup. Right here. Every military person needs a coffee cup. See if I can put it somewhere. Put it out here. They would basically get about a pound of bread and a pound of meat a day. Now this looks like a big what? Cracker. When you're eating crackers today, that's the descendant of this army bread called hardtack. It even has little holes in it. Okay? Now the men would get this, and it was hard bread because it held up better. They would try not to eat it, just putting it in their mouth and trying to break it because they call it a cracker for a reason. When you're trying to bite this, something cracks. It could be this or your teeth. So anyway, they'd usually pound this up and maybe soak it in some coffee or whatever just to make it easier. The most important item they had, and for anybody in the military, is coffee. I know I was in the Navy and we did a lot of coffee drinking. And for these men, coffee was very important, especially out on the march. In the diary, Thomas talks often of how good the coffee tastes. And they would be given coffee beans. They were green. They hadn't been roasted. The men would have to roast them up the way they wanted them, either light or dark. And then they had a problem. They didn't have coffee grinders. So you're thinking, how are these men going to take those coffee beans? I've got some here. Here we got some solid coffee beans. Now if you're at home, you probably have a grinder and you grind them up. These men did not have coffee grinders, but they do have the Enfield coffee pulverizer right here. Okay? They would take the coffee beans, put them into this coffee sack that they have, put it down on the ground or on the rock, and they start pulverizing. 9.5 pounds of Enfield Rifle will pulverize that quite well. When they're finished, they would have it down small enough consistency that they could then boil it. In some cases, they would pound on it so much it got powdery. And they found this was kind of neat. When they'd go to boil up their coffee, they could make coffee almost instantly. I guess they invented instant coffee, right? So they were very ingenious in how they dealt with these things. And I'll pass around if you're interested. I got that one here somewhere. Beans. You might be interested to just pass it around and pulverize that. You can see it gets down pretty fine. Then they would take their coffee cup, put that on the fire, and get it boiling, and make the coffee as strong as they'd like. And when they have to pull it off the fire, they can't drink it right away because this tin is very hot. You stick it to your lip, you're going to make a big mistake. So they'd sit around and cool it. And they'd often fall out of marches to make themselves a cup of coffee for their coffee break. And you'd see along the line of march, you'd see men in the infantry over on the side with a little fire. There'd be some of them that pulled it off the fire, and they're cooling their coffee. Because of this, the men in the cavalry called the infantrymen coffee coolers. Of course, the infantry called the cavalry some other names too, which I won't mention. But anyway, this is a very important item. I'm not carrying a canteen. A lot of men did not carry canteens because the water is heavy. They would wait till they came to a well or a stream. Can you imagine 100 men coming up to a stream to get some water? They're very thirsty. And everybody's crowding in. If you have a canteen and you're trying to fill it, I don't know if you filled a canteen lately, but you gotta hold it just right, let the water flow in. This way a man can come up to the stream very quickly, you don't have to call it when somebody else is back. Reach in the stream very quickly, dip up some water and start drinking. So this is a very important item for the soldier. And Thomas talks a number of times about how good the coffee tastes when they come in from being out on guard or whatever. The other item that they would have the bread, and for their meat, they would get something really delicious. Salt pork. By the way, this is not a Civil War Ziploc bag. I put this in here for practical reasons so I don't have to handle it. So they get about a pound of this, a pound of bread, and in many cases, if they had time, they'd boil it before they would go out on the march. But in many cases on the march, they would take this, they would cut it in strips, take their bayonet right here, and use it to fry it over the fire. The bayonet was used for a lot of things. It makes a great candle holder. Stick it right in the ground. Didn't have flashlights in those days. And so, very practical thing. You can also, cook some meat over the fire using this. So that was basically their food out on the march. When they were back in camp, things were a little bit better. They had more rations and so on. But it seemed like they were always hungry because, they were very active and, and whenever they found something, a chicken or a cow or whatever, they would dispatch it so they could have some food. So that gives you a little bit of the idea of the equipment that he carried as a soldier. And as already has been mentioned by Bev, his compassion for other people, it's amazing reading through that diary. There's a copy here at the library. I've had the opportunity to read it here recently. Is the kindnesses that he would do for people. There was a man here in Ortonville, Ed Cassidy. He had been drafted and joined the regiment at Chattanooga in January of '64. And at one point in February of '65, he gets a letter from home and he shows it to Thomas. I know from looking at the 1860 census for Ortonville that Ed Cassidy had a wife and 2 children. So I don't know if one of them was sick or what the situation was. Thomas was up to go home on a 30-day furlough. And he had not seen his family since '62 when he joined. And so he told Ed that he would go to the captain and see if he could arrange it for him to take his place, which he did. And he sent Ed home with his Army overcoat to give to his father. And so Ed promised that he would, and Thomas gave him a list of things to bring back. He brought back some boots and other items from his family. And he was figuring that, well, I've only got a couple more months left until my enlistment's up. He had signed up for 3 years. Of course, in that time, he could have been killed in battle or an accident. They were working and doing different things. So he decided that he would let Ed Cassidy go home and see his family and pass up his opportunity to come home and see his. So it gives you a little idea of the type of person he was, in addition to what Bev has already mentioned about his compassion for the enemy. And he was violating Army rules by doing those things. If he had been caught doing that, he could have been severely punished. But he let his humanity rule his decisions. And I think that says a lot about him. He was risking his own, you might say, discomfort by helping another human being. And what is interesting is in the diary, one of the things I was fascinated with, when he came home, he walked up to about the Brandon Township line. It was late, and he laid down and went to sleep, got up the next morning, and as he came on home, I don't know exactly on Persian Creek where he did it, but he stopped to clean up. He'd been traveling, and so he decided to wash up, change his clothes, freshen up a bit before he went on home. So as I go by Persian Creek here, at times I think, I wonder where along here Thomas cleaned up. Was it downstream from the bridge? Whatever. But it's just one of those little neat things in his diary. And living here, and you read the diary, you know about these places, so it makes it very personal. I feel a closer connection to Thomas. He was born in October of 1844. I was born in October of 1944. So, you know, and what is interesting in doing my research, I gave a talk to the Oakland County Pioneer Historical Society a week ago Sunday, and the slides that I showed them, there's a picture, and Bev showed a picture where they were at Lookout Mountain up there, and on the very point, at Point Park at Lookout Mountain, is where my great-grandfather, who was in the Confederate Army, served. He was up there during the war. And right below is Moccasin Point. This is where Thomas was. So my great-grandfather could have looked down from that height and saw those Yankee boys down there. He goes, "Hey, isn't that Tom Tucker from Ortonville?" No, not really. But there's a connection. I feel, you know, I'm interested in Civil War history, obviously. And you realize, you know, that there's these similar things. His family was from England, mine was from England years ago. And I ended up living in Ortonville. My first house on Sands Road was 1.5 miles from where the farm was on State Park. So I guess it's almost, I don't know, preordained or whatever, but some mysteries going on here, different things that brought me to giving a talk on Tom Tucker. And he had an opportunity to read his diary. It's here at the library. It's fascinating just to read and realize that this was a young man from Ortonville, a recent immigrant to this country, who decided to go off and serve his new country. And he did a great job, in my opinion, doing it. And it's been an honor to give a talk on him, as I did a little over a week ago, and come here tonight to add to Bev's wonderful talk on the family. Now I feel like I know just about everything I need to know about the whole thing. So anyway, thank you all for coming.
What about that?
I got so many things to talk about. This hat here you often see Civil War soldiers wearing. A lot of the men in the Michigan units wore this type of hat because it's more practical, especially if you're standing out in the rain. This is very stylish, copied from the French Army, called a kepi. But if you're standing out in the rain, it doesn't do you much good. Because you'll notice this hat, if it rains, the water will run off and go on your shoulders. This hat, the water it catches up here. This little basin, so if you move, it's going to come down, right? If it hits here, it's going to run right down your neck. In a nice cold rain, you're standing out there on guard duty, it feels good having that cold water go right down your neck. Whereas this one is a little bit more practical. And so most of the men from Michigan would wear these types of hats. Any other questions anyone might have? I'm trying to cover things here we'll quickly here. I know what time is.
Michigan men are smarter.
Beg your pardon?
Michigan men were smarter.
Practical, more practical. That's right. They are smarter, practical.
Did the Union soldiers wear gray pants too?
Gray pants?
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, just wondering.
Are you thinking about this?
Yes.
This is a standard uniform
Okay.
for the Union Army. This is exactly the same type of cloth. This is made up in Fort Huron. Same grade of cloth that was used for the Civil War uniforms was used in this. Wool is not itchy if it's good quality. It's soft. If wool is itchy, it's cheap. You know, so it's fairly smooth. Even on a warm day, it's not that uncomfortable. But the uniform, as the soldiers said, it's too warm in the summer and it's not warm enough in the wintertime. But it was their year-round uniform. I see a hand back there, sir.
Do you know if Thomas Tucker bought his own firearm? Because I think he brought it home. I know he could
I
have
can't
found it in
recall.
the war or
Sometimes-
something like that, but
I know
some people back then used to buy their own
Right.
when they went in.
A lot of people did, and they found out on marches that pistol was heavy, and a person had to get very close. You want a pistol that shoots, may hit somebody, maybe back there, wall, or you want this weapon here that will reach out 4 football fields and hit somebody. And it was heavy. They rarely use their pistols. You see a lot of pictures of the soldiers with pistols. That was done in the studio. They had it as props. And some men did buy their own weapons, but they found out after a while that was a lot of weight to carry around, and it was not that practical to do it. So a lot of them sent them home or sold them. Yes, sir.
He was in the cavalry, right?
Infantry.
His brother was in the cavalry.
Okay.
He was in infantry. And they did a lot of marching in Kentucky. In fact, at one point they marched from one location to another, and they got there so quickly that a cavalry commander, a Union cavalry commander, was so impressed. And he started calling them the marching regiment because they were always marching here and there and very quickly. And the Confederate side, in the Shenandoah Valley, a man by the name of Stonewall Jackson, his infantry was noted for marching very quickly from one point to the other, and they called them Jackson's foot cavalry because they moved so quickly. And with carrying all this equipment, hot day, dusty roads, it was not a very pleasant experience, that was for sure. Any other questions? Someone might have. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. I hope I've helped you understand a little bit about Thomas Tucker's role.
I know family members who probably own one of those diaries like this. Read it, because it is just full of so much information. I bet some of you haven't read it. So do that. Thank you. Come get some cookies.